being here. Thank you, Greg and Steve. It's really a pleasure to be here. And Greg and Steve are, two scholars and thinkers who have worked very hard to understand what's happening in Venezuela now. So I appreciate both what they said today and also their work, which is, as I said, very serious. If you read the catalog for this conference, the title of our panel is Evaluating Chavez from the Left. And then the blurb says, the international left must address whether we should line up behind Chavez. Is he a populist and dash or a revolutionary? And is the opposition in Venezuela perhaps correct? So our task is to evaluate, what's happening in Venezuela from the left. And we have heard two analysts to help us think about that, how to engage that process. And Steve started by saying that, it's hard to be in this podium blinded by the light that was facing, and it's even hard to see you. And the image I had almost is of, the famous parable of blind, wise, very wise, like Greg and Steve, men, blind, trying to, touching an elephant and trying to identify the elephant and describing what they see by the parts they were touching, and the difficulty of, having a complete picture of that creature if you don't see what, depending on the part you are touching. In the case of Chavez, I think the image of the elephant, perhaps we should substitute the elephant for a porcupine, a porcoespín or something like that. Venezuelan politics to describe that, because if you could imagine a panel not just with Steve and Greg, but with maybe 10 Venezuelans or 20 Venezuelans here, you would have, and maybe from different political positions, even from within the left, you would have very, very different ideas of what kind of creature that is. So, in part because what's happening in Venezuela is a process of transformation, which has polarized Venezuelans, both within Venezuela, outside, and also in international observers. So rather than answering the question whether he's a revolutionary or a populist, whether the opposition is right or wrong, what I would like to do is maybe comment on the question itself and help us think a bit about how to think about that question. So it's very frustrating. I remember my father-in-law would always ask me, well, tell me, Fernando, is Chavez right or wrong? Is he good or bad? And it's very hard, when you have that kind of polarized questions of white and black, because history, of course, is made of grays, and we're not talking about the person, but the process, and it's always difficult to pass judgment. And also the question of evaluating something from what perspective, in terms of what standards, in terms of what values, what do you mean by left? What is your understanding of what the leftist transformative process is? So those are the kinds of questions, I guess, that I would like us to think about. I remember at one point in Venezuela asking Teodoro Petkov, who was one of the major leftist leaders in Venezuela, a member of the Communist Party, a guerrilla leader in the 60s, then founder of a movement of Socialismo, MAS. Then in 1996, Rafael Caldera, in 1993, Rafael Caldera was elected president in opposition to the neoliberal policies of Carlos Andrés Pérez. And Caldera came to power promising the population that he would revert back to a protectionist state, to a welfare state. And in 1996, Caldera said, we have to go back to, basically we have to give up the agenda Venezuela, the Venezuelan agenda, which was his protectionist program, and adopt to a neoliberal program, because we have, as he said, no hay remedio, we have no alternative. And I asked Teodoro Petkov, who was his Minister of Planning at that time, what's the difference between being a leftist leader in the opposition to the government and being in the government itself? And he told me, well, you become aware of what the constraints are. It's easy from the opposition to expect, demand, and argue that everyone in the barrios, for instance, that's the example he gave me, should have a sewer system and water, but it's very difficult once you're in power to actually make sure that everyone has water and a good sewer system. And I think that one of the things that I want to highlight, I guess to start with, is it's very difficult for us, not being inside the process of transformations in Venezuela, to understand how difficult it is to effect historical change, to understand the constraints within which governments like the Chavez government, or like Evo Morales, or Lula, or Bachelet, or Kirchner, the constraints they face in trying to implement transformations. So, first note a note of caution about, the difficulty of evaluating that kind of thing, and also from what position one evaluates. I mean, oftentimes, when I talk to people who, identify themselves as part of the international left, how to evaluate Chavez, they tell me, and I'm talking about very important, European and even U.S. Intellectuals and Marxist activists, said, look, I know that the reality of Venezuela is very complex, but for me what is important is that Chavez is against Bush. He's against imperialism, he opposes the war in Iraq, and that for me is enough. For that reason, I support Chavez. And my response to that, that's of course one very important consideration, but one also has to have an understanding of the complexities of the process, because on the one hand it's important to support people who are against, let's say, imperial policies, but one has to, as both Steve and Greg have emphasized, the importance is not to focus on the person, but on policies, on processes. And I guess this is the basic, message. I don't want to take too much time, that I want to emphasize that when one looks at Venezuela, my first point would be to try to understand complexity, to understand that it's a complex process, and on the other hand, to understand policies, processes, to understand that one is not, one of the dangers, I think, that Steve pointed out very clearly, one of the problems in evaluating the Chavez regime is precisely that one talks about the Chavez regime, that somehow, we come from the left, we have understood, for instance, Marxist and this, critique of commodity fetishism, but one of the problems is that precisely we confuse a process of political transformations with a particular figure, and we attribute to that figure the agency of that process. What we have to do is not thinking of Chavez, or Vargas, or Perón, or Fidel, or any one person as the embodiment of historical transformation, but the radical leftist process precisely is about creating the conditions in which people, the majority of people, everyone, can participate in the processes that define their lives, and the conditions of increasing equality. So that what we have to, the question that I think from the left one should ask, what's happening in Venezuela? Is there a process of transformation with majority of the people are increasingly participating in the processes that determine their lives? And I think that one of the characteristics of the promise of the Chavez regime from 1998, and that's when the reason it became very popular, because it came as a result of the process of growing polarization in Venezuela, in which a majority of people were largely excluded from the political process. And I think one of the great merits of Chavez is that to have placed in the agenda, in the political agenda in Venezuela, that it's the people, the population at large, that should be the agents of their own history. And this is, I think, a great accomplishment in the context of a society that was deeply divided, which had become depoliticized. And as a result of Chavez, in a way, there have been mobilizations, both from the part of the Chavistas who support Chavez, and also the opposition that is against Chavez, and Venezuela has become much more political, more politically mobilized. But I think I would like to make a distinction also between political mobilization and political participation. And I think one thing is to be mobilized in marches, which is very positive and very necessary. Another thing is to be able to be organized, to participate in the decisions that affect your life. I think Chavez is fighting a front at two levels. Internationally, of course, he wants to create conditions of more international equality. Domestically, he also wants to create conditions in which people participate in the political process and make decisions. This is, in part, the political project. What we have to understand also is that the practices that are involved in this process are these practices in correspondence with these political aims.